Warren and found that they would reduce wage growth. For more on that report, let's bring in Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He is American Action Forum president and the former director of the CBO. And Doug, people tend to paint these two candidates kind of with the same brush. Is there a differentiation between the two of them in their budgets in terms of what it would mean for the budget deficit and in terms of what it would mean for growth?
Well, there's certainly not a big difference in their wealth tax proposals. The top rate in the Sanders proposal is 8%. The top rate in the Warren proposal is 6%. You find out that, under Sanders, workers lose about $1.6 trillion in wage income. Under Warren, it's $1.2 trillion. That's over the first 10 years. So they're qualitatively the same. Bernie's stuff's just a little bit bigger.
In terms of what that means for growth, how do you take those numbers and then try and figure out GDP, what happens to it over time?
Well, I mean, this is a decline in GDP, and the question is, where does it come from?
Yeah.
These proposals have been portrayed as, we're just going to take some money from a few rich people. There's not going to be any consequence for the middle class. We really just wanted to find out if that was true, and so we worked through the full implications in the economy.
And again, those numbers, the $1.6 trillion from Sanders, the $1.2 trillion from Warren that would land on the middle class, what are those numbers? What are the taxes that kind of eat into that? How would they see that?
So that would show up as smaller paychecks. The mechanism's pretty straightforward. You tax people in their wealth, and that's a tax on the supply of capital. You get less capital, less investment, productivity growth slows, and that always shows up in paychecks in the end. So over time, the burden of that tax gets shifted from directly on the affluent and the wealth that they hold into the economy, and indeed, in the end, to workers. This is exactly the same conversation we've been having in the tariff world. You put a tax on imports, a tariff. We know the importer has to send a check to the government. But what we've been trying to figure out is, do they raise prices for consumers and thus shed the burden and shift it somewhere else in the economy? It's the exact same thing going on in this wealth tax. It gets shifted elsewhere. And indeed, over long periods of time, about 63 cents of every dollar of wealth taxes would end up as lower wages for people going to work.
It's interesting that you haven't heard any of the other Democratic candidates making arguments like this. They may not have embraced the same tax structure, but I haven't heard any of them on the stage say, I'm not embracing those taxes because of what it will mean for workers or what it will mean for the economy.
I do think that's interesting, and I think it's because these have been cleverly advertised as small taxes on a few rich people. But if you think about it, those few rich people were chosen because they own a disproportionate share of the investable wealth in the economy. So it's a tax on a big chunk of economic activity. And as it turns out, they're not a small tax. If you take the Sanders 8%, if you make 6% return on your capital, it's taking all of it and more. These are very, very draconian taxes when viewed as an annual tax on the return to capital. It's not surprising that if you have a draconian tax on a lot of investable capital, you're going to have consequences.
The reason I think most of the Democrats are afraid to take it on is because there is a sense that there's a huge problem with inequality in this country right now. How would you suggest there's a better way to deal with it than the proposals that we've seen from Warren and Sanders?
I think that's exactly the right way to think about it. One of the messages of this paper is it's not wrong to try to have a progressive tax system. It's dangerous to do it this way. What we probably should do is go back to a more traditional income tax and have higher marginal rates and a broader base and get rid of the kinds of loopholes and deductions that characterize the tax code. That's a more efficient way to collect the same revenue with the same targets and then go off and have the debate about how you want to spend it.
Is there any candidate on either side of the aisle that's embracing such a solution like that?
I haven't seen it. What we've seen instead is a real push toward higher rates without fixing the base first, and a real focus on taxing capital income. And they tax capital income because they think only the rich have it, but that's the same capital income that funds pensions for firefighters and policemen. It's the same capital income that school teachers are going to need when they retire. So you have to be a little bit careful about going after the real fundamental thing that allows an economy to grow, the act of saving, investing, and creating greater productivity.
All right, Doug, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Becky.
Okay, we have some news on